Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Well, there has been another series of sanctions applied to the Russian Federation. We expect that just like the sanctions before these, very little will come from these sanctions. Outside of Starbucks coffee shop disappearing and becoming Star Coffee, we don't believe the average Russian is feeling much in terms of these sanctions, and will probably feel very little in terms of new sanctions. Now, Western and U.S. sanctions applied to, say, Iraq, applied to, say, Serbia, those sanctions would bite. They would have and have had an impact. But the reason sanctions do not work with Russia is too big. One, it is the largest planet on Earth. Number two, it produces or has access to producible natural resources that exceed every other country on the planet Earth. And not just oil, coal, natural gas. It's all encompassing. Metals, iron, steel, aluminum, nickel, tin, copper, palladium, platinum, gold, agriculture, timber. And then furthermore, what helps Russia is that it borders the most populous, or one of the most populous countries on Earth, and that is the People's Republic of China, in excess of 1 billion people. And not too far from the southern borders of Russia is India, which also exceeds 1 billion people, clamoring for the resources that exist in the Russian Federation. It's not going to affect them. Another case in point. Electric vehicles. The current Joseph Biden administration, along with far left state governments such as in California and New York, are forcing electric vehicles, EVs, on many of its citizens. There have been dates announced such as 2020, 2035, 2040, where you will have to own an electric vehicle. Now, is that going to work? Is that going to increase the popularity of electric vehicles? Probably not. It's going to do just the opposite. The market will ultimately demand what persons want to purchase. But with that being said, these electric vehicles use large amounts of metals. The most common EV battery is made up of essentially, I believe it's 80% nickel, 20% cobalt, 20% lithium. It's a lithium-ion battery. So the U.S. and the large battery manufacturers, Panasonic, the battery manufacturers like LG in South Korea, have a requirement for nickel. You have to have large amounts of nickel. The U.S. requirement for nickel exceeds what the U.S. produces in terms of nickel. The U.S. produces something like, I believe it's 13,000 tons of nickel. So the U.S. produces 13,000 tons of nickel. The requirement for nickel, in terms of the U.S. need for these electric batteries, and it's even larger in China. The Chinese have an incredible need for nickel in these batteries. I think the Chinese, the new cars sold something like 22%. EVs, electric vehicles in the United States was something like 14%. But the overall world requirement for EVs is something like 1%, and even much lower in Russia. The Russians are not adopting the electric vehicles like some of these other nation states. But the Russians produce 200,000 tons of nickel, many times greater than what is produced in the United States. So the U.S. needs things that the Russian state produces. Palladium, another example. Gold. Everyone needs gold. No matter what you say or how much you believe that your currency is worth, or you believe you have the reserve currency, gold is going to supersede that. At the end of the day, if we go into the future, if we go 1,000 years into the future, I guarantee you in 1,000 years the dollar will not exist. But if I bring you a lump of gold and you have something that I want and I offer you that lump of gold, in 1,000 years you will take that lump of gold. Now, the earth may not exist. We may blow each other up. But I guarantee you, the value of gold will always outpace and hold more value than any currency on the planet. And that also goes for silver as well. But again, that is why Russia is immune to sanctions. Smaller countries, yes. But you have a country that is, as I said before, the largest country on the planet Earth with 145 million people that produces the largest amount of natural resources on the planet, or doesn't produce, has access to. That country will simply be resistant to any sort of sanctions you could possibly apply to them. And unfortunately, here in the United States, the average ill-informed urbanite, that's what most Americans are now made up of, ill-informed urbanites, low IQ urbanites, obsessed with popular culture, and has little understanding of what is happening in the world around them. So when they hear the United States is applying sanctions to Russia, they correlate that to, well, the effective sanctions that may have been placed against Iraq or Serbia or some other smaller nation state. It's not going to work. Maybe back in the 1900s, or back when Russia was a semi-feudal monarchy, maybe, but not now. They are simply sanction-proof. It's not going to work. Now, as for the ongoing war, the situation continues to worsen for the Ukrainians. The big issue now is really kind of transitioning from the lack of ammunition, the lack of munitions that the Ukrainians have access to, but also which will be more important, will be fighting age men. As I talked about before, the average age of a Ukrainian soldier is now 43 years old. It's the dad's army. And in many cases, it exceeds that 43 years. Many units contain elderly Ukrainian men. Men that are in their 50s, late 40s, even early 60s. And that's the casualty rate. But it's also the cultural change in Ukraine. The new generations that, as I talked about before, that are so enamored with pop culture are pansies. They are sissies. They do not want to fight. The younger generation that did report for duty earlier in the war, many of those men are now dead or wounded or amputees. So they have run out of the volunteer fighter, which made the Ukrainian military so effective in the early days of the war. So now it's the dad's army. Now, we expect that the current Russian offensive will continue. We believe now the Ukrainian defensive lines all along the front are starting to crumble, and we're seeing that. We have seen it in Bakhmut. We have seen it most recently near Avdiivka. But this Russian strategy designed to simply wear the Ukrainians out. Again, more people, more natural resources, larger economy, greater military-industrial capacity. The Russians are almost on a war footing. They have not entered the total war phase yet, but they have entered the early stages of a war footing where the economy has transitioned to a focus on manufacturing military goods, military products, military systems, arms, armament, ammunition. And that's what's happening. And the Russians, furthermore, are able to reach out and strike the limited arms production capacity of Ukraine. They are able to reach out and strike and interdict the arms and weapons that Western countries are attempting to introduce or have introduced into Ukraine. The Ukrainians and its Western allies are not able to interdict Russian factories, Russian depots, the ability of the Russian state to manufacture weapon systems. And furthermore, a lot of some of the few items that Russia may not produce is coming in from China, because the Chinese need Russian natural resources. So I just wanted to talk about that. Wanted to have a look at those sanctions and why Western sanctions are going to be relatively ineffective. The perception, again, from the low IQ urbanite here in the United States will be, oh, well, those sanctions will have an impact. They are not having an impact. They are not having an impact. There may be some issues with travel and Russians having the inability to go certain places, especially those in leadership roles that have been sanctioned. But outside of that, the living standard in Russia has not changed. Not from sanctions, at least. Again, the only real change would be you can't get Starbucks, you just get Star Coffee. And who cares? Have a good day.